You're listening to Talking Freely, where we discuss culture, politics, and religious freedom. Talking Freely is a podcast from Freedom for Faith, a Christian legal think tank that exists to protect and promote religious freedom in Australia.
Welcome to Talking Freely. My name is Rowan McHugh. With me today is Stephen McAlpine, who is a blogger and an ex-journalist writing on issues of theology, culture, and the church. He is a pastor at a church in Perth and also works at a national level for City Bible Forum, developing and presenting evangelistic material for a project called Third Space. His new book is entitled Being the Bad Guys: How to Live for Jesus in a World That Says You Shouldn't, which is the topic of our discussion today. Steve, welcome to Talking Freely.
Oh, great to be with you, Rowan, and enjoying what you guys do as well. It's an interesting space to be in the Western setting at the moment.
You've spent many years as a pastor in your hometown of Perth. What are some of the reasons that you've been gradually drawn to engaging with the culture and to public Christianity?
Well, that's a good question. I didn't have much of an interest in one sense for a long time, although my first initial study was in culture, and communications degree at Curtin University here in Perth in the 80s. And there were so many wacko ideas that were presenting themselves, and a certain hostility towards Christianity from the whole deconstruction movement, that I thought, wow, I wonder if these ideas will ever fly in the public square. Surely not. And yet here we are. And so what I noticed more than anything was that the Christians I was involved with and shaping and helping understand more about Jesus and how to live their lives were finding that there was more cultural pressure on them on a daily basis, just getting up and going to work, just the feeling of slight hostility towards their Christian framework in their job settings, especially in larger companies and things like that, where there was a social policy agenda in some of these companies. And I just noticed that coupled with late modernity's sort of push with the economic sort of almost a very a strident economic rationalism, and this sense also of the Christian framework has had its day. It needs to settle down. It's not the good news that it once was said to be. People feeling under pressure. And so as I started to read and think more about these issues, I realized that getting into a public square conversation for the sake of people in the church isn't a bad idea. Now, it doesn't mean to say I use, the platform or the pulpit to proclaim my politics or cultural frameworks. I'm there to expound the good news about Jesus. But it was good to be informed as to what's going on for people in their average daily lives and what are the pressures they face as they live for Jesus in a world that is increasingly suspicious of the Christian message and views it more and more as a power play by which you can control or manipulate people.
In your book, you acknowledge that there are genuine cultural and historical wrongs that Christians need to right. Could you take us through some examples and how it is we can discern the difference between reasonable criticisms about Christian engagement in public life and unfair treatment by being presented as the bad guys?
Yeah, that's a vexed question. And one of the reasons I think that some Christians in the public square can become quite defensive of Christianity is that they think if we even just allow a chink in the armor to say we got a few things wrong, there's no safety brake on the opposition. They're going to come steamrolling over the top of us, so they don't give anything away. But I think you'd have to admit that the church, and not just the church, the rest of society as well, in a secular sense, there were issues that the church didn't deal with. There's obviously the big one of the institutional abuse issues in some of the churches and the repair work that needs done there. There's also a sense too that the Christian framework, when it was taken on a wider level, took on a moralism that sort of shunned the outsider, especially those who may have had a different understanding of certain things, or even just struggled with sexuality issues or a brokenness or something that the church thought would be tainting if we allowed it into our sort of under our network. And so I think the church is now at the place where it's having to realize that it wasn't able to craft the culture to be Christianized and easy to live with. There's going to be mess for the church, and it's going to be messy at times. And so I think some of those issues are issues as well. The church led well in many areas of life, and down the centuries we know that slavery and emancipation issues and freedoms for other minorities has been led by Christians. So I don't want to rewrite history a la the sort of hard politics on this at the moment and say that Christians have just been slow on the uptake on everything. They clearly haven't. But there has been, as we got comfortable in the West, a tendency to look after our own and to shut down any concern or debate. And I think some of those things are coming back to haunt us a little bit.
In your book, you examine the Bible's use of a suffer now, glory later motif. When we consider the vastness of social media, cruelty seems to be everywhere and going in all directions towards the political left and right, Christians, Muslims, Jews, atheists, and so on. So how can Christians understand suffering for Christ whilst avoiding accusations of having a persecution complex?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I think the suffering for Christ aspect, and someone wrote this to me the other day, a wise man just said, who'd read my book, said, just remember that the suffer now, glory later aspect also there's a deep joy in following Jesus in this age. There's a deep joy in who we are in Christ, in knowing our identity in him. So it's not all, there's more than my job's worth kind of suffering. It's the suffering of having the world say something against you, not because you've done something wrong, but because you refuse to align yourself with its practices that are going to lead to death. And so I think in one sense, what we're saying is the suffer now, glory later is the paradigm of what the scripture is saying, but we don't have to get into a persecution complex at all. The fact that Christians will be persecuted, and by persecution, if you think of 1 Peter, it isn't even talking about being jailed. It's talking about the scorn and ridicule for following the Savior and for aligning yourself with the one who was rejected, the Lord Jesus. And in that sense, you can do that joyously and joyfully because you know that you are receiving the outcome of your faith, the salvation of your souls, as Peter says. And so what keeps us, the safety brake that keeps us from having the persecution complex has to be the end goal of where God is taking his story in salvation. And it is a new creation, and it is putting all things right. And if we let that eschatological framework fall off, I think we tend to hit politics harder and more angular and more in a way that's sort of defensive, as if politics is going to solve our issues. And as we've seen over the last few months in the United States, when that fails to happen, there's a lot of anger, and we don't want to go down that line.
Cultural and political engagement by the church can look like we're just protecting our own patch and self-interest, or engaging in an imposition of undesired values. Is there a difference between right cultural engagement and just pursuing a kind of Christianizing project that you mentioned earlier?
Oh, yes. I think this is not a call for us to retreat from the public square and just take our licks in the sense of you've had your say for, how many hundreds of years, get out of the public square. This is a place where you can bring good ideas and good policy or good policy that springs from good ideas into the public square. How you come across in the public square is going to be important. But I also think that if a secular society such as we live in has the confidence that it says it has, it should be able to allow what I call alternate ethical communities to exist, and not simply exist, but to flourish within its setting. So the great irony in the sense of Australia is that at the same time that we're increasingly told we're secular and increasingly more people are ticking no religion on the census, things like Christian schools, which are funded partly by state and partly by federal governments and partly by parents, are booming. And they're not booming with Christians running away to hide in them. They're booming with 80 to 85% of non-Christian parents sending their children to independent Christian schools because they see something about the framework of life that is put together, the pastoral care, the sense of direction and a commitment to not just any truth, but an objective truth as central. They want their children to taste the fruit of the gospel, even though they may not accept the roots of the gospel themselves. So I think it's a strange time, but I think if you can build strong alternate ethical communities, which includes the church and Christian schools and things like that, you're showcasing to the world that despite what the Twitter feed might say, Christians actually are kind and loving and generous and want to serve other people, not just themselves.
You mentioned that the current cultural strife is not just a war over rights, but is something deeper around fundamental questions of human flourishing that could only be described as religious in character. Can you take us through why this is the case?
Yes, I say that it's the heat in the battle, in one sense, in the public setting with Christianity at the moment, is over alternate gospels. The gospel, the good news of Jesus Christ, is coming into uh, contact with another gospel altogether that says your true freedom, your true salvation is found by you being the most autonomous, authentic person you can and crafting yourself at your deepest identity levels the way you wish to. And at the moment in our culture, your deepest identity is around your sex and your gender. And it's, in one sense, it's a parody of the gospel because there's a liberation salvation story built within that that says you can be loosed from the surly bonds of your own sort of frailty and the mistakes of the past by shaping and changing yourself to who you want to be. And Bruce Jenner, Caitlyn Jenner, is the prime example, I think, that 40 odd years ago, Bruce Jenner was the pinnacle of manhood when he won the gold medal in the decathlon at the Montreal Olympics. And he was then the pinnacle of womanhood within the same generation when he was on the front cover of Vanity Fair magazine and then voted Woman of the Year. He had suffered gender dysphoria all his life. And he's an interesting character because he's actually deeply conservative and has a strong religious framework. But he has been presented as this person who was able to craft this salvation story, which is almost like a resurrection story. And I think the post-Christian experience that we're living in now is not the same as the pre-Christian paganism. What you're getting is that all of the language and tools and artifacts of Christianity are still there. They're still available, but they're being used for a different purpose. And Mark Sayers, a Melbourne pastor and great writer, said that the project at the moment is very much, we want to create the kingdom without the king. It's got all the tools and desires and this the Christianized framework that there's a better future ahead, which is very much a Christian thinking. It's not sort of ubiquitous around the world that the future is somehow going in a certain direction. Many cultures are cyclical in their understanding of history. But Christianity gave this narrative of there's a better place ahead. And when you suck the gospel out of that and suck Jesus out of that, you can craft a utopian ideal that uses all of the same frameworks and hopes and languages, but without Jesus. And I think on the left, there's a kingdom without the king desire, where we're going to get these rights and we're going to put things in place, but it doesn't take account of human sin, I think. But on the right, there's what I call Christendom without Christ. We want to return to the values frameworks of Christianity, but we don't necessarily need Jesus in that. We just want to be conservative in our social values.
You refer to secular voices that have pushed back against cancel culture, saying that their efforts are grounded in goals that differ to Christian goals, namely the preservation of autonomy and Western traditions. To what extent should we defend Western traditions where they coincide with theological truths? And what should it look like for us to engage with secular co-belligerents in the promotion of goodness?
Oh, I think you've got to take the idea of common grace fairly seriously when you think that there are people who look at the Western world and say something about the West is palpably different because of what Christianity did in it. And Tom Holland in his book Dominion, and Douglas Murray in his book The Madness of Crowds, and writers like that, and Jordan Peterson, for example, though he's probably a bit more combative in many areas, but especially Tom Holland and Douglas Murray, who are not Christian, are saying, you will lose something if we lose the Christian framework, because it's providing a safety net for people in a way that we don't realize. And Douglas Murray says it, that in our current culture, without Christianity, there's nothing to replace it that can offer you forgiveness and reconciliation. All you will face is fiery denunciation, and they can keep your sins up before you because Twitter does not forget, unless it cuts you out, of course. But there's a sense in which those kind of characters are recognizing that all of the things that we take for granted in a Western setting of understanding human rights, the autonomy of a person, and the value of a human being, and the need to have rights, didn't spring from nowhere. They sprang from a Christian framework, because as you look around other places in the world where Christianity has not had a foothold, They are not there to the same level in any way, shape, or form. And so it would be naive to think that you could jettison the Christian framework and cut off the gospel roots, and somehow the fruit would always continue. And Ross Douthat in the New York Times, and he's a Catholic writer, said, if you think the Christian alt-right is a problem, wait till you see the post-Christian alt-right. And I think what he's saying there is there's a leavening effect of Christianity in the culture that we can't even see. It's just in the water we swim in. And if we take it out, or if we cut the gospel framework off from it, we're going to find that life becomes a little bit harsher than it is now.
There's a view within the church that claims if what you're saying about human flourishing is true, then it's better to have the light of churches and Christians shine in contrast with an ever-darkening world. In other words, isn't the gospel better served by a cultural collapse around us, where people then thirst for the relative stability of Christianity, rather than people living in a Christian way that gives them stability without the need for Christ?
In one sense, that's a good idea. I don't know if I particularly want a Christian civilization for what it is to collapse around me in order just for the sake of this shows the gospel more brightly, because I don't think I'd want to return to or even a move forward to a post-Christian paganism, because I think it would be a difficult, horrible place. But having said that, over the last 15 to 20 years, one of the things we thought we should be doing is try to make the church relevant again, because, life was too good. People weren't interested in Christianity, and Christians were just thought of as a bit lame, and no one was interested. And now we realize it's resilience we need, because the framework that we're up against is much harder and much harsher. But as the church learns to live resiliently and learns to double down on discipleship and loving and serving and forgiving and showcasing those things that Douglas Murray says are absent from our secular culture, I certainly think that the church is going to shine brightly. But Mark Sayers adds the caveat in some of his writings where he said, despite this sort of collapse of the Christian framework, the world in the West hasn't collapsed into a zombie apocalypse, basically. And he puts a classic line where he said, Mum's upstairs reading 50 Shades of Grey. You can tell the book's a few years old. And while Dad's in his den having a look at porn on his phone, and both parents go to bed early so they can get the kids to soccer in the morning. It doesn't sound like the zombie apocalypse. And he describes it as a beautiful apocalypse. It's a bright, shiny facade, but there isn't much behind it. So the things you're going to find isn't that there's going to be like the movie Children of Men, tribal gunmen in every street in every city. But what you are going to find is, as we are finding, a mental health tsunami, an increase in loneliness, an increase in distrust, an increase in anxiety across our Western culture that is not commensurate to how good we have life compared to other settings. And it seems that mental health tsunami and things like that, the anxiety levels have ramped up, and people are saying, I just don't know what's wrong. There's something wrong, but I can't put my finger on it. I think that's what's going to happen as Christianity recedes from the public square a little bit. And I think churches that can position themselves with a hope in the gospel, which aren't looking to fight with everyone all the time, but are looking to serve their communities, even if their communities don't appreciate it, they will be places and beacons where the tsunami can wash bodies up at their doors, and they'll be able to help them and serve them. So I think there's a good future in that. It's going to be quite bracing, but it is eventually coming, I think.
Something you warn the church about is the temptation to publicly represent itself as a victim, or for Christians to embrace victimhood. What are some of the ways that the church does this, and why is it a flawed method of cultural engagement?
Well, in the irony, of course, is that at the same time that our tools of engagement and terminologies have been taken over by the sort of the kingdom without the king crowd, there's a whole language around victimhood that springs from identity politics that it has got a very good sugar rush because it gives you immediate status, because at the moment the victim is everything in our culture. The victim has now been given a voice that they didn't have before. And if we start to say, well, we're victims too, we'll play the victim card, there's always someone who can trump you with a better victim story. At the same time, the church would have to understand that it has made a few victims along the way as well. So I think it's a very tense, it's a tenuous thing to link ourselves to the victim narrative that quickly, but also because it then sets us on a path of hopelessness. I'm just a victim. But the Bible is interesting in how it describes human beings as both victims and perpetrators. And the tension for the Christian is to say, what have we done wrong that we need to put right? Where are things unfair? And that's where we can actually push back on it. But to simply play the victim card and as a get out of jail free card is kind of like a sugar rush. It hits you hard early and you can get angry and frustrated and bemoan your fate. But in the long term, that won't play out well. And the progressive narrative in our culture sees that already and says, no, church, you don't get to play victim. You were bullying for too long. Now, whether that's true or not isn't the point, but I think those terminologies have got a short shelf life with Christians because we're being told, no, you can't be the victim. And once you start to say I'm the victim, all you're doing is you're lining yourself up with a special interest group who should be given special status for something. And I don't think that's what we should be looking to do. It's not a good apologetic for the gospel. And it's not a good witness to Christ, who it says when he was reviled, did not revile, but entrusted himself to the one who judges justly. Perhaps this will push us back onto a more transcendent understanding of what God's doing and the fact that we are waiting for a day of vindication. We don't need that vindication now. It's nice to have it, but we are waiting for a day of vindication when Jesus returns.
When looking over the Bible story as a whole, some social critics apply the example of Elijah, who employed satire and mockery in his own cultural engagement. Do you believe these methods have a place alongside the commandments from Jesus to love our enemies?
Well, if I said no, I'd be going against some of the things I write on my blog. So I do think that the satire aspect is important. Bearing in mind that the people that the prophet Elijah satired the most and mocked the most was the church of his day that had gone corrupt. So we're talking that he was speaking within the nation of Israel. But I do think in our culture, satire and mockery, when it's done well, has a strong cultural sort of grab. And I think if Christians can understand how to do satire and mockery in a way that isn't brutal and nasty, it can raise questions. It can raise issues for people to think through the inconsistencies of their own argument. So I do think in the right hands, it can be done well, but when it's done poorly, it comes across very sort of angry and judgmental. So I think you've got to do it well, and there are examples where it is done well, and I probably think you can do it, but you've got to be very careful how you do it. A, because we're not an Old Testament prophet ourselves, but B, because in the long run, Jesus reserved his sharpest criticism and mockery for the religious leaders in his own setting. And so we had to be very careful how we use it, I think.
A challenge within our diverse city churches today is differences about partisan politics and political priorities. With specific secular challenges of the present day in mind, what insight can you offer about holding inflexible lines of truth whilst at the same time promoting charity and solidarity?
Yeah, that is increasingly going to be an issue for churches going into the future, because the partisan politics thing seems to be sweeping over the top of a lot of churches. And I think you have to hold to an orthodox understanding of the Bible on salvation, who Jesus is, his exclusivity, what it means to be human, and how we understand our humanity from Scripture. And it's always coming down to a question of authority. Where does authority lie? But within that orthodoxy, I think there's plenty of room for differences of opinion and differences of practice in how you go about solving things. So in one sense, I like to see a church setting which, this is what I've liked about evangelicalism in Australia and the UK, is that they're hard to pin down on social issues. Some issues seem more socially to the left politically, and some issues seem more socially to the right politically. But many evangelical groups in the UK and Australia especially don't just sit in one camp. They're not just right-wing on everything or left-wing on everything. They see justice issues across the spectrum, and they see the need to support, say, for example, helping women understand about pregnancy issues, and they're not pro-abortion, but at the same time, they're pro-refugee. I like to see the church being almost confusing to the world looking on, going, we can't pin you down. And you go, that's right. We don't want you to be able to do that. So you're going to have churches which are able to tolerate difference within their own settings, because people are coming into their churches who are all Christian, but they have different views about the political process. But you will only get fired up and totally angry about the political process if you think it is the absolute foundational reality or solution to what our culture needs. But if you see the church as an alternate polis, an alternate city, an alternate politic, then you're going to soften your attitude towards those who differ with you politically, because you realize that you are maintaining the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace within the church setting. And the church is going to be the thing that's going to be critical going into the future, when it's well discipled, well disciplined, well loving, and it's unified in its local settings. It's going to make a difference, I think.
A related issue is the deeper question of political theology. In the United States of America, it's not just being torn apart by the Republicans versus Democrats issue, but also how a Christian should think about things like race and the various kinds of critical theories. You mentioned intersectionality in your book. Can you expand on it and offer some thoughts on how to resolve some of these church conflicts?
Yeah, if I could do that, I could have resolved them. Look, I think that there's a place for the church, especially the more well-heeled conservative churches, to sit and listen for a while to those who have been impacted adversely by the cultural sort of norms of the past. And I think that's one of the issues we really have to be careful of, that we need to be ready to listen to where people might be hurting before we say something, because we're always coming up with a solution very quickly. And I think the intersectionality one, the difficulty I have with it, this is no framework for grace within its setting. And in one sense, it's a bit of a Mobius strip, those loops that go in on themselves, where, for example, the fact that you don't know that, the fact that you claim that you're not racist shows you're racist. And I go, well, that's not a good place to start a conversation with someone. The gospel has to be the leavening effect that all have sinned and fallen short of God's glory. And when Paul writes that in Romans, he's not talking simply about every person on the planet, though that's true. He's talking about the difference between the Jewish understanding of themselves and the Gentile understanding. And he's saying to the Jew, all have sinned. Even those of you who feel you are righteous, there are things that you have done wrong. You are not just victim, you are also perpetrator. I think getting back to the understanding of the gospel and how that begins would be a really good place to start. And there's some great books by black pastors. Esau McCauley, I think it is a great book that he wrote on reading the Bible as a black person. And what I've loved about that book is just how gospel-centered it is, and how it exposes the reality of how racism has affected people in the US. But it says, without the gospel, all I can do is get angry about this. But the gospel allows me to show my white brothers and sisters a way forward that looks like reconciliation, without isolating them or just casting all the blame on them for everything. And I think that's a good way to start. And it's costly for both groups, because it says that people are going to have to live with the tension of not being fully understood or not getting full reparation in this life. But I think that's the key. We are not looking for full reparation in this life for every injustice. We are saying we want to move things forward towards justice, but one day full justice will come eschatologically. And that's the safety valve, I think, for conversations around justice among Christians.
You draw from philosopher Charles Taylor and his idea that we now live in a culture that places a premium on authenticity. How can Christians witness in a world where authenticity has taken on its own sacred foundational force, to the extent that even happiness and flourishing are no longer necessarily expected alongside it?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yes, look, I think the search for authenticity, there's a great book by a Canadian philosopher called Andrew Potter called The Authenticity Hoax, How We Got Lost Finding Ourselves. And I think part of the Christian witness in this setting of authenticity is that people are actually finding that the deeper they dig within themselves to find their authenticity, the less they find. And the problem with the authenticity search is that if you alone are the one responsible for your authentic self being realized, you alone are to blame when you don't manage it. And I think the authenticity search then becomes this frantic search for something that you can arrive at that will give you satisfaction, that you feel you've arrived. But I don't think people actually are experiencing that. And it doesn't take much in a culture to upset that authenticity search and to leave you with questions beyond whether you're actually arriving at it. Things like let's pull something out of the air, a pandemic, for example. At the end of 2019, your authenticity search for 2020 may have been crafted a certain way, but no one predicted what was going to come down the track. And the fact that, even in Australia, Medicare is now funding double the number of psych services or psych assessments or sessions that you can attend under Medicare funding from 10 to 20 shows that we know there's something wrong, that people are anxious and worried and not sure of themselves, even at the same time that they're looking for this authentic self that they're crafting. And so what you can end up doing is saying that the self-authenticity search will rack up a body count around it in order to find its most authentic self individually. And there's a great irony in there, because we're saying we want to create good communities and we want a community of love and justice. But at its core, the authenticity search is selfish. It will sacrifice others on its own altar. And you see that when, someone leaves their spouse for the sake of their own authenticity search, they are applauded. And the damage done behind them of a broken family or children who are bewildered by what's happened with a parent is sort of photoshopped out of the story. So the authenticity search has to be curated. It takes a lot of time, energy, money, and it's something I think that the top echelon of society can have, but it doesn't really translate well down the food chain. Many of the things in the authenticity search of extreme individualism, doing what you want sexually, going where you want, that's fine and good if you've got money and contacts, but it's costing further down the food chain. And I think that's a key issue, that people are finding they are being broken and dismayed by this constant search for something authentic in themselves, and they're not necessarily liking what they find.
Looking inside the church, what are some of the ways that Christians might be unwittingly absorbing subtleties of this authenticity doctrine into their thinking and living?
Oh, the first thing that comes to mind is when people come into a church, I just automatically assume they consume, that they're coming as a church primarily, often as a product, not as the body of Christ to which they will attach themselves and serve. They may think that, but I automatically assume that they have got the same iPhone in their pockets with the same access to Babylon on it as everyone else. And so the question they come into in a church setting is, how can this serve me? Now, the extreme versions of that are the prosperity gospel and also that therapeutic gospel of you can craft your best self in this church setting. And the, serving others is just the byproduct of you getting a happy life. Whereas really it's the other way around, that the happiness and joy is the byproduct of serving others, as Jesus would say. So I think whenever people come into a church setting who are Christian and baptized and they can say the creed or whatever, they're still thinking consumerist. They're still thinking, I'm crafting my life and my ways towards creating this narrative. And you see that too in the collapse of volunteerism in churches. No, volunteerism has collapsed in secular societies and organizations as well. But there's a sense which the busyness of life, of which we get churned up into, we take on unwittingly. And in all of those busynesses, especially with our kids, we're crafting the good life. And we have to take a step back and say, is that what the good life is described as in the Bible? How far can I go into this search for a good life for my family and my kids and crafting their futures before I start to become idolatrous in it? Is there a sense in which I need to step back and say, we have to be satisfied with a little less than what the culture is getting and not be just aping it in every respect that we do? Because there's a bit of, we're getting boiled in the water slowly, I think, of the cultural framework, and we unwittingly buy into its authenticity search, even at the same time as we baptize it with theological terminology.
Conversely, in what way can the church publicly demonstrate a plausibility structure that communicates goodness and beauty to our culture today?
Well, I think on a number of fronts. I think long-term, low-key relational life is a key. What I found is that when some friends of mine who aren't Christian, the husband's dad died. They knew some Christian friends of ours through the school setting we were in, and it was the Christian people who knew them who rocked around on their doorstep with meals, not to, now you must trust in Jesus kind of conversations, but here's a meal. I know it's going to be busy for the next week. And they made the observation that it was the Christians. And one of my running friends, who's an ex-Catholic from Ireland, and there's no one as against God, I think, these days, than an ex-Catholic from Ireland for some reasons. She said to me, because she and her family have moved here, her husband and her daughter, I envy you Christians. I see the Christians in our running group and I think, wow, your level of community is amazing. And we don't have that. It feels like you've got a family beyond what we've got. And I think those little things are super important. But it's also, how do we serve other people? And so, for example, someone who's fairly well educated engineer, professor at my old church, he and his wife put an extension on the house, not so they could have a better life, but so that they could foster several local Indigenous children, because our area has a high need for foster care and very few people taking it up. So they now have 3 of their own children and 2 young foster children, and it's tiring. But those foster children are coming in on a Sunday to church and just hanging out with other kids and having fun and being looked after and being fed well and engaged with their own biological families well through this couple in the church. And now 2 couples have started doing that in the church and taking on foster children. And I think it's those little things that are noticeable and little things that change. And I think it's, how do you eat an elephant? You small bites, I suppose. And that's how you're going to actually do these things over time. It's the parable of the yeast. It's the parable of the mustard seed, that it grows from a very small thing into something big.
With your thumb on the pulse of culture, over the next decade, what do you predict the political and cultural landscape in Australia will look like in terms of religious freedom?
Well, I guess as I look at the legislation that's going around the states at the moment, I get a bit worried. I'm involved in a local Christian education association as a board member. And I think there'll come a time where you have to sign off on certain ethical frameworks as a school if you're going to receive government funding. I do think that in one sense, the gospel of the secular age is going to trump many of the ethical frameworks of the Bible, in the sense of you have to sign off on these things. So the legislation in Victoria at the moment over conversion therapy, it's very clear that it's a very rare thing, these conversion therapy techniques, but it's been rammed through in the legislation in both the councils, or both the chambers of Parliament in Victoria, that there's going to be fines for trying to convert anyone, and it's a very vague term what that means, or abuse someone's position through preaching the Bible, or maybe doing a Bible study or something like that. So I think there's going to be a lot more interventionism from governments, especially state governments, on religious freedom issues. And the fact is, though, most of the population probably doesn't care about it because they don't have much Christian framework or involvement. At the same time, I do think, and we've talked about this with some of my other colleagues, while it still feels never more hostile than it's ever been, it also feels never more open. People are genuinely asking questions. What is going on? Is there something beyond this life that I can cling to? What framework can I have in these shifting sands of culture? Because it's not just Christians who are looking around and saying, gee, things are changing a lot and rapidly. Everyone's looking around saying that. They're looking for some sense of security. And whether people put that in nationalism or whether the people put that in sexual identity, people are saying there is a problem. We can't figure out why things are shifting the way they are, but we're in a great cultural seismic shift. And I think the gospel has to prepare itself and among God's people. God's people have to prepare themselves to be able to be a solid place, a solid community in the midst of that. And I do think that things will ramp up legislatively, and that there will be more pressure on churches to conform to what I call the secular age, to sign off on those things if you want funding or if you want approval by the state.
The book is Being the Bad Guys, How to Live for Jesus in a World That Says You Shouldn't, and it's available for purchase now. Steve, thanks very much for being with me today on Talking Freely.
Oh, it's great to have spoken to you, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what Freedom for Faith is going to do in the coming months and years, especially as these times do get a little bit trickier for us all.
That's it for our latest episode of Talking Freely. If you'd like to get in contact with us, you can do so through our website, www.freedomforfaith.org.au. Freedom for Faith exists through the generous donations of individuals and organisations across Australia. If you'd like to financially partner with us, you can do so through our website.